A talking baby once built a time machine to undo the death of the family dog, and it worked. That same dog has fathered a human child, has hidden a loaded secret in a safe, and has died for real before a grieving infant brought him back. An entire finished episode about abortion was locked away and never once allowed to air at home. The show itself was cancelled, buried, and then dragged back to life by the sale of plastic discs. And in the quieter corners of the internet, people insist that none of it is real, that the whole bright cartoon world is unfolding inside the shattered mind of a father who lost everyone he loved. Tonight, this video moves slowly through 10 chapters, 5 of the strangest true pieces of the show's own history, and 5 of the darkest theories its fans have ever built. Eyes closed is fine. Drift off whenever the calm takes over. Welcome to Red Umbrella. Let's get started. Before the Griffins existed, almost everything that grows enormous begins as something small and private, made by a person nobody is watching yet. A song hummed in a kitchen, a drawing folded into a notebook, a short film handed in for a grade, meant to be seen by a teacher and a few classmates, and then quietly forgotten. The Griffin family, who would one day be recognized in nearly every corner of the world, started life in exactly that humble way, as a class project made by a young art student who had no idea that the strange little cartoon in front of him held the shape of the rest of his life. The student was Seth MacFarlane, and in the middle of the 1990s, he was finishing his studies at the Rhode Island School of Design, a respected art school in New England. Like many students in his program, he was required to produce a thesis film, a final animated project that would stand as proof of what he had learned. The film he made in 1995 carried the title The Life of Larry. It was short, rough by the standards of a polished network cartoon, and built entirely around a small cast of characters that anyone familiar with Family Guy would find unsettlingly recognizable today. At the center of The Life of Larry sat an aging, balding, heavy-set man named Larry, a dim and good-natured figure who moved through ordinary domestic life with a kind of clumsy confidence. Beside him stood a talking dog named Steve, who served as the smart and skeptical voice in the room, the one who saw through Larry and commented on the world with a sharper mind than his owner. Larry had a wife in the film, and her name was Lois. He had a son as well, a boy named Milt. Stitched between the animated scenes were short live-action segments in which MacFarlane himself appeared, introducing certain moments and setting up a few of the jokes before the cartoon resumed. What set this student film apart from the thousands of other thesis projects made that year was not its budget or its polish, because it had little of either. What set it apart was its structure. The Life of Larry had already invented the central machine that Family Guy would later run on for decades, the sudden jump away from the main scene into a brief, unrelated joke, the technique that fans would come to call the cutaway. It also leaned heavily on references to movies, television, and the wider pop culture of the day, the second habit that would define the later show. The skeleton was already there, years before anyone outside a small art school had heard a word about it. The overlap runs deeper than tone, and this is where the early film becomes genuinely startling to look back on. A number of the specific jokes that appear in The Life of Larry were lifted, sometimes almost whole, into the first episodes of Family Guy years later. A gag about a flashback to a particular city, a moment involving a character experiencing something for the first time at the age of 30, and a scene poking fun at the relationship between God and a long-suffering figure from Scripture all found their way into the pilot of the eventual series. A parody of a famous science fiction television program turned up again in an early Family Guy episode. A bit involving a game show appeared once more in a first-season story, built around the family dog. The student had made a sketchbook of ideas without realizing it, and he would spend the show's opening years quietly emptying that sketchbook onto a national stage. The film did not stay locked inside the school, and the way it escaped is the first real hinge in the whole story. A professor of MacFarlane's was impressed enough by the thesis to send it along to Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio behind decades of classic cartoons. The studio took notice, and roughly a year later, the young animator was hired. He arrived at one of the most storied names in the history of the form, and he went to work contributing to the kind of programs that filled the cartoon blocks of the era, including well-known shows that ran on Cartoon Network during that period. Around the same stretch of his early career, he also took on writing work for an animated Disney production, building the ordinary resume of a talented young person learning the trade from the inside. During his time inside that studio system, MacFarlane did something that would prove far more important than any single assignment. He returned to Larry and Steve. Cartoon Network had a program that functioned as a kind of proving ground for new shorts, a showcase where animators could try out fresh ideas in a few minutes of film. And in 1997, a retooled version of his characters aired there under the title Larry and Steve. This second short kept the dim, middle-aged man and his intelligent talking dog, but it trimmed away the rest of the original cast. Larry's wife Lois and his son Milt were gone. The focus shifted away from Larry himself and onto the dog, with the little film centering on how the two of them came to find each other. The tone of this second short was gentler than the first, and that softening was deliberate because the showcase it aired on was aimed in part at younger audiences. The cruder edges of the thesis film were sanded down. The humor leaned more toward broad, classic, almost old-fashioned cartoon comedy, the kind of wild and bouncy style associated with the golden age age animators of an earlier era, rather than toward the shock value the brand would later become famous for. There was even a change to how the talking dog worked. In this version, by the account of those who have studied the shorts closely, only Larry himself could understand Steve when he spoke, a small twist that set it apart from how the later series would handle its own talking dog. Among the small details buried in that 1997 short are a handful of seeds that would bloom into entire characters. At one point, Larry mentions a store, and the name attached to that store reads, depending on the source, as either Stewie or Stewie. Either way, the name that would later belong to the youngest member of the Griffin household, the baby with the aristocratic voice, made an early appearance here as nothing more than a passing reference to a shop. The spelling drifts a little across the different tellings of this story, so it is fair to hold that particular detail lightly, but the connection itself is clear enough that it has become a well-known piece of the show's origin. There was also, in that short, a character who would grow into one of the most recognizable figures in the entire series. An airline pilot appears briefly, and observers have long noted that his voice and his general appearance line up closely with Glenn Quagmire, the Griffin's relentless neighbor, who is himself written as a commercial airline pilot in the show. The resemblance is strong enough that this pilot is widely regarded as an early sketch of the character, another face from Quahog quietly waiting in the wings years before Quahog had a name. A figure resembling the man who would become Peter's stepfather, Francis, has also been spotted in the early material, one more familiar shadow moving through the background of these tiny films. Beyond the names and the faces, the foundations of the main cast were already being poured. The talking dog Steve was the direct ancestor of Brian Griffin, the sophisticated, martini-loving, world-weary pet who would serve as the family's voice of reason. Larry was the rough draft of Peter Griffin, sharing his rounded shape, his general bearing, and, importantly, his voice. The origin of that voice is a small and human story in itself. McFarlane has explained over the years that he based Peter's distinctive sound, which had grown out of Larry's, on a security guard he once overheard talking while he was a student. Larry's wife and Peter's wife share the name Lois, though the two women did not look much alike, and Larry's son Milt carried a basic design that would echo forward into Chris, the Griffin's awkward teenage boy. When executives at the Fox network eventually saw the two Larry shorts, they recognized something in them worth betting on. The studio approached McFarlane and contracted him to build a full series around these characters, a show that would carry the title Family Guy. The animator was still remarkably young for such an opportunity, a man in his 20s being handed the reins to his own network cartoon, a rare and heady position for someone so early in his career. The deal placed an enormous amount of creative trust in a person who, only a few years earlier, had been turning in a class assignment. The launch the network arranged for the new show was, by any measure, a position of extraordinary privilege. The first proper episode, titled Death Has a Shadow, was given a slot on a Sunday night at the end of January in 1999, airing in the valuable stretch of time following the broadcast of the Super Bowl, when a vast audience still sat in front of their televisions. That kind of placement is the sort of gift a network reserves for a program it wants the whole country to sample at once. A short film made for a grade had, in the space of a few years, traveled from a small art school to one of the most watched evenings on American television. The connection between the humble shorts and the eventual juggernaut never fully closed, and the show has occasionally reached back to honor it. Years into its run, in a much later season, Larry himself returned for a brief cameo, a quiet nod from the enormous series to the tiny film that gave it life. The reference would have meant nothing to a casual viewer, but for anyone who knew the history, it was a small and affectionate acknowledgement of where it all began. The original sketch granted a moment of screen time inside the empire it had spawned. What makes this origin worth dwelling on, beyond the simple pleasure of tracing a famous thing back to its first form, is how much of the finished show was already present in that first form. People tend to imagine that a hit program is invented in a writer's room by a large team refining ideas over many months, and a great deal of Family Guy certainly was built that way. The core of it, though, the cutaway rhythm, the pop culture obsession, the dim father, the brilliant dog, the wife named Lois, the son shaped like Chris, the baby's name, the pilot who would become Quagmire, existed in rough form before any of that machinery ever switched on. The seed contained an astonishing amount of the tree. There is something quietly moving in the gap between the scale of the beginning and the scale of what followed. A young person sat alone with limited tools and a deadline and made a strange little cartoon about a fat man and his dog, mostly to prove he could finish something. That cartoon could easily have gone the way that almost every student film goes. Watched once, graded, and then left to gather dust in a drawer. Instead, it found the right professor, who sent it to the right studio, which led to the right showcase, which caught the right executives, which produced one of the most recognized television franchises of the next quarter century. The whole towering result rested on a chain of small, lucky turns, any one of which could have broken and left the Griffins forever unborn. For the generation that grew up with the show, learning about these origins tends to reshape how the early episodes feel on a rewatch. The jokes in those first seasons that seem to repeat ideas, the references that feel oddly familiar, the sense that the show arrived almost fully formed, all of it makes a different kind of sense once the shorts are part of the picture. The earliest Family Guy was, in a real way, a young creator translating his own private notebook into a public language, carrying forward gags he had been carrying for years. The familiarity was not laziness. It was a person finally getting the chance to say out loud the things he had been quietly sketching since school. The deeper lesson hidden in this beginning is about how fragile and accidental the start of something huge can be. None of the lore this video will explore, none of the deaths and resurrections, none of the banned episodes, none of the universe-bending experiments the show would later attempt would exist at all without a class assignment and a teacher who happened to drop it in the right mailbox. The grand machine that could kill a character and bring him back, that could leap across infinite universes, that could rattle networks and inspire furious theories among its fans, traces its entire bloodline to a balding man named Larry and a dog named Steve. Everything that follows in this story grew from that root, and keeping that root in mind makes the later wonders feel less like the output of a polished corporation and more like the long, strange dream of one person who once just wanted to finish his film. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A class project about a man named Larry and his dog Steve quietly became one of the biggest cartoons on Earth, yet the show very nearly died young, axed and forgotten by its own network. What saved it was something almost no other program has ever managed. Section 2. The show that died and came back television is a graveyard, and most of the stones in it are unmarked. For every program that runs long enough to become a household name, there are hundreds that flickered briefly and vanished, canceled after a handful of episodes, pulled from the schedule and never spoken of again. Cancellation in the ordinary life of a show is a death sentence with no appeal. The sets are struck, the writers scatter to other jobs, the actors move on, and the network's attention turns to whatever fresh thing might fill the empty slot. A canceled show stays canceled. That is simply how the machine works, and it had worked that way for decades by the time a young cartoon about a family in a town called Quahog ran headlong into it. Family Guy arrived in early 1999 with every advantage a new program could want, launched into a massive audience in the warm afterglow of the year's biggest broadcast. The advantages did not last. Once the show settled into the regular grind of the weekly schedule, it found itself in trouble almost immediately, and the trouble had less to do with the quality of the jokes than with the cold arithmetic of when and where the episodes aired. The network moved the show around, and the moves were rarely kind. A program's success depends enormously on its time slot, on what airs before it and after it and against it on competing channels. And Family Guy kept being placed in difficult spots, scheduled opposite some of the most popular and well-established programs of the era. An audience can only watch one thing at a time, and when a new and unproven cartoon is set against beloved hits that viewers have followed for years, the new show tends to lose that contest. The ratings sagged, the sense of a struggling program settled in, and a struggling program, in the eyes of a network counting its money, is a problem to be solved rather than a treasure to be protected. The solution the network reached was the usual one. Around the turn of the millennium, Family Guy was canceled. The exact sequence of what followed has a few twists that different accounts describe with slightly different emphasis, so the careful version of the story is that the show did not die cleanly once and stay dead. It received a reprieve of sorts, a chance to continue, and then ran into the same ratings troubles all over again, leading to a second cancellation a short time later. By the time the dust settled, somewhere in the early years of the new decade, the show had been pronounced dead more than once, and by every normal rule of the industry, that should have been the end of it. The Griffins should have joined the vast, silent crowd of canceled cartoons, remembered fondly by a small group of fans and forgotten by everyone else. What happened instead was something close to a miracle in the world of television, and it is worth slowing down to appreciate just how unusual it was. The show came back, and it came back not because an executive had a change of heart or because a new champion arrived to rescue it, but because the audience that the regular schedule had failed to gather went out and found the show on its own terms, in two places the network had not been counting on. The first of those places was home video. In the years after the cancellation, the early seasons of Family Guy were released for people to buy and own, packaged together so that fans could watch the episodes whenever they pleased, rather than hoping to catch them at whatever odd hour the network had buried them. The sales of those releases were enormous, far beyond what anyone had expected from a canceled cartoon. The precise figures are reported with some variation across different accounts, so it is fair to describe the result rather than fixate on an exact number, and the result was startling. The home video collections became one of the best-selling television releases of their moment, proof in hard sales of a hunger for the show that the ratings had never managed to capture. The second place was a late-night block of cartoons aimed squarely at adult viewers, which began airing reruns of the series. Freed from the brutal competition of the prime evening hours and placed instead in the late-night stretch, where a younger, edgier audience was wide awake and watching, the show suddenly found exactly the crowd it had been missing. The reruns drew strong numbers. The episodes that had floundered against family-friendly hits in the early evening thrived among night owls who wanted something sharper and stranger before bed. The show had not changed at all. The placement had, and the difference was night and day. Together, these two streams told a story that the network could no longer ignore. The home video sales proved that people people would pay real money to own the show. The late-night reruns proved that people would reliably tune in to watch it when it was placed where they could find it. The combined message was impossible to argue with. A canceled program was quietly outperforming many shows that had never been canceled at all, generating revenue and ratings from the grave. Faced with that evidence, the network did something it almost never does. It brought a dead show back to life. New episodes of Family Guy returned to the air in 2005, several years after the cancellations that were supposed to have ended it. The revival was a genuine rarity, an instance of a network reversing its own death sentence because the audience had refused to accept it. In the long history of television, only a small handful of programs have ever managed this particular trick, clawing their way back from cancellation on the strength of home video and reruns, rather than on the strength of their original broadcast. Family Guy became one of the defining examples of the phenomenon, a show whose resurrection was driven by its fans buying discs and staying up late, a kind of grassroots rescue conducted entirely through the marketplace. The crucial thing about the resurrection, and the detail that shapes everything the show became afterward, is what did not save it. The show was not rescued because it had softened its humor, or smoothed its rough edges, or made itself more palatable to the people who had complained about it. The opposite force was at work. The very qualities that had made the show a risky bet in the first place, the crude jokes, the shocking cutaways, the willingness to go where other cartoons would not, were precisely what its loyal audience had bought the discs to see and stayed up late to watch. The audience had voted, with money and with attention, in favor of the show's most provocative instincts. The lesson the creators could reasonably draw from their own revival was that the path back to life had been paved by their boldness, and that boldness was therefore something to lean into rather than to restrain. Lean into it. They did. The revived show that returned in 2005 was, by wide agreement among those who have followed it closely, a meaner and bolder animal than the one that had been canceled. The art grew a little sharper and a little bloodier. The jokes pushed further. The general spirit of the program tilted harder toward shock value, toward the deliberate courting of discomfort that would define its public reputation for years to come. The seed of provocation that had been present from the very first season now had proof that provocation paid, and the comedy escalated accordingly. The show came back not chastened by its near death, but emboldened by it, convinced that its survival was a reward for its nerve. That emboldened second life is the version of Family Guy that most of the world came to know. A casual viewer who thinks of the show is far more likely to be picturing an episode from the long, confident post-revival run than one of the scrappier early installments. The cancellation and the comeback, in other words, did not merely interrupt the show's history, they split it into a before and an after, with the after being longer, louder, and more extreme than the before. The program that exists in the public imagination is largely the product of the resurrection, shaped by the particular lesson the resurrection seemed to teach. The vindication of the comeback reached a remarkable peak a few years later, in a way that would have seemed unthinkable during the dark days of cancellation. In 2009, Family Guy received a nomination for one of the most prestigious honors in all of television, a place among the nominees for the industry's top award for a comedy series. The significance of this was hard to overstate. It marked the first time in nearly half a century that an animated program had been nominated in that particular top category. The first since a famous prehistoric cartoon family had earned the distinction back in 1961. A show that had been canceled twice, written off as a failure, and revived only by the stubbornness of its fans, had climbed all the way to a nomination once reserved almost entirely for live-action prestige comedies. The show did not win in the end, losing to a celebrated workplace comedy of the era, but the nomination alone was a statement. The medium of animation had been let back into a room it had been kept out of for decades, and Family Guy had been the one to open the door. There is a deep and slightly uncomfortable irony folded into this whole chapter, and it rewards a moment of reflection. The network had canceled the show because the show was not delivering an audience in the way the network wanted, on the schedule the network had chosen. The audience existed the entire time. It had simply been looking for the show in the wrong places, or rather, the show had been placed where its true audience could not easily find it. When the barriers came down, when people could own the episodes outright and watch the reruns at the hour that suited them, the audience materialized instantly and in force. The failure had never really been a failure of the show. It had been a failure of fit between a bold program and the cautious slots it was crammed into, and once that mismatch was corrected, the supposed flop revealed itself as a juggernaut. The story also carries a quiet lesson about the shifting power between the people who make television and the people who watch it. For most of the medium's history, the relationship ran in one direction. The networks decided what would air and what would vanish, and the audience could do little more than watch or not watch. The Family Guy revival was an early and striking sign of that arrangement beginning to crack. The fans, through their purchases and their viewing habits, had effectively overruled the network's decision. They had reached past the executives and resurrected a show by sheer collective demand, demonstrating a kind of power that audiences had rarely been able to exercise before. In the years that followed, as new technologies gave viewers ever more control over what they watched and when, that power would only grow, and the show's comeback stands as one of the early landmarks on that road. For the generation that grew up with the show, the cancellation and revival can be a genuine genuine surprise to learn about, because the program feels so permanent, so woven into the fabric of television, that the idea of it ever having been killed seems almost impossible. A person who has known Family Guy as a constant presence for their entire life, always there in reruns and streaming libraries and references and merchandise, may find it strange to imagine a moment when the show was gone, written off, surviving only as a collection of discs and a fond memory among its earliest fans. The permanence is an illusion created by everything that came after the rescue. The show that seems like it could never die very nearly did, twice, and owes its entire later existence to a stretch of years when it was technically dead. That brush with extinction left a mark on the show's very character, and it helps explain a great deal of what the program became willing to do later. A show that has died and come back has, in a sense, already faced the worst the industry can do to it and survived. It has less to fear. The ordinary anxieties that keep most programs cautious, the worry about cancellation, the fear of pushing the audience too far, lose some of their grip on a show that has already been canceled and proven that its audience will fight to bring it back. That fearlessness, born partly from the trauma and triumph of the resurrection, would soon lead the show to attempt things that almost no other program would dare, including the deliberate killing of one of its own most beloved characters. The show had learned that death was not necessarily permanent. Before long, it would put that lesson to a test that shook its fans to their core. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A canceled and forgotten cartoon was hauled back to life by its own fans, then grew bolder than ever, and climbed to honors once closed to animation. Having survived its own death, the show learned that death need not be final. Soon it would aim that lesson straight at the heart of the family, at the one character no one believed it would ever dare to lose. Section 3. The Day They Killed Brian. There is an unspoken agreement between a long-running show and the people who love it, and it concerns safety. The audience understands that anything can happen to the minor characters, the one-off guests, the figures who exist only to be tormented for a single episode. The core family, though, the faces in the opening titles, the voices that have filled a living room for years, are supposed to be untouchable. They can be humiliated and injured and drop from great heights, but they always return whole by the next episode, because they are the reason the audience keeps coming back. To harm one of them permanently would be to break the agreement, and most shows, sensing how much the audience depends on that agreement, never dare to break it. Family Guy broke it deliberately, with full knowledge of what it was doing, on a single autumn night in 2013. The character it chose to break the agreement over was Brian Griffin, and the choice was almost cruel in its precision. Brian was not a peripheral figure. He had been present since the very first episode in 1999, the family's talking dog, the worldly and self-regarding intellectual who served as Peter's drinking companion, Stewie's partner in adventure, and the closest thing the show had to a voice of reason. Among the family, Brian was the one many viewers found most relatable, the one whose loneliness and failed ambitions and quiet decency gave the show some of its rare moments of real feeling. He was, for a great many fans, a favorite. The show knew this. The impact of what it planned depended entirely on knowing it. The episode that carried out the act bore a fittingly ominous title, Life of Brian, and it arrived in the show's 12th season, broadcast on a Sunday night in late November of 2013. The setup was almost unbearably ordinary, which only sharpened what came. Brian and Stewie are out in front of the house, getting ready to play a game of street hockey together, the kind of small domestic moment the show had built 1,000 times. Stewie realizes he needs his knee pads and heads back inside to fetch them. In the brief window while the baby is gone, a car comes speeding down the road and strikes Brian, leaving him gravely injured in the street. What followed was the part the show staged with unusual care, and it deserves to be described plainly. Brian was rushed to a hospital, and the family gathered around him in his final moments. There was no last instant rescue, no absurd reversal, no cutaway to deflate the tension. The family pleaded with him to hold on. Brian, broken and fading, was unable to do so, and he died there with the Griffins around him, fully and apparently permanently. For a show that had spent its entire life puncturing every serious moment with a joke, the decision to let this one play out with genuine gravity was itself a shock. Critics noticed. One prominent review described the death scene as surprisingly affecting, observing that it came about as close to being genuinely moving as the show was capable of getting. Others were harsher, arguing that killing a main character was a hollow stunt dressed up as bravery, an easy grab for attention rather than a real creative choice. The split in the critical reaction would foreshadow the much larger split in the reaction of the fans. The show did not leave the family without a dog for long, and the speed of the replacement is part of what made the death feel so brutal. Almost immediately, the Griffins adopted a new pet, a streetwise dog named Vinny, voiced by an actor well known for playing a memorable character on a famous crime drama. Vinny was not a bad character. He had his own warmth and his own appeal, and the performance behind him was widely praised. The problem was the timing and the framing. By installing a new dog so quickly, in the very space Brian had occupied, the show seemed to be announcing that the death was real and that life would simply go on, that Brian had been not only killed, but already replaced. For grieving fans, the arrival of Vinny did not soften the loss. It rubbed salt in it, suggesting that their beloved character had been swapped out like a worn-apart appliance. The reaction from the audience was immediate, and it reached an intensity that genuinely caught the show's own creators off guard. Within hours of the episode airing, a petition appeared online demanding that the character be brought back to life, addressed to the show's creator and the network that carried it. The petition argued that Brian had been an essential part of the viewing experience, the witty and sophisticated presence that gave the show some of its depth, and it warned that the program would lose viewers if he were not restored. The response was overwhelming. The petition gathered signatures at a remarkable pace, climbing into the tens of thousands almost at once, and eventually surpassing well over 100,000 names, by most accounts somewhere beyond 120,000. It became one of the fastest-growing entertainment petitions the platform had seen, a flood of public grief and protest aimed at a cartoon dog. The devotion did not stop at signatures, and some expressions of it were striking in their permanence. There were fans who marked the loss on their own bodies, getting tattoos in memory of the character, including memorial designs mourning his passing. A piece of ink etched into skin to grieve an animated dog is a strange and powerful thing, and it speaks to how real the attachment had become for the people who felt it. To the show's makers, who had perhaps expected a few days of chatter, the depth of the response was a revelation. They had known Brian was popular. They had not fully grasped that, for a large slice of the audience, he was loved in a way that made his death feel like the death of a friend. The reversal came quickly, and it arrived wrapped in the show's own peculiar logic. Brian had been gone for only a short stretch, dead across roughly 3 episodes, when the show brought him back in an installment broadcast in the middle of December, an episode built around the Christmas season. The method of resurrection drew on machinery the show had established long before, and it leaned on the youngest member of the family. Stewie, still grieving the loss of his closest companion, encounters at a mall a version of himself from a different point in time, a past Stewie who happens to be carrying the time machine that the baby genius had used in earlier adventures. Seizing the opportunity, the grieving Stewie uses that machine to travel back to the fatal moment and intervene, preventing the car from ever striking Brian. The death is undone at its source, erased from the timeline, and Brian returns to the family alive and whole, as though the tragedy had never occurred. The choice to resurrect the character through time travel rather than through some softer dream or trick mattered, because it folded the whole episode into the show's larger canon rather than waving it away as a fantasy. Brian had genuinely died within the world of the show, and a genuine act within that world, the rewriting of time, had brought him back. The death counted, and so did the rescue. The arrival of the replacement dog, Vinny, was similarly tied off rather than ignored. Although his role in the family was swept away when the timeline was restored, the show eventually gave the character a gentler send-off in a later season, finding him a place rather than simply discarding him. A small kindness extended to a character who had been caught in the middle of a storm not of his making. What truly illuminates this entire episode, though, is the explanation the show's creator offered afterward, because it laid the strategy bare. Once Brian was safely back, the creator finally addressed the death publicly, and he did not pretend it had been anything other than a calculated decision. He described the killing as a stunt that had performed exactly the function it was designed to perform. The point, by his account, had been to remind everyone that the show was still a place where anything could happen, that even after so many years on the air, it had not grown safe or predictable, that the audience could not take the survival of its favorite characters for granted. The death, in other words, had been a demonstration of the show's continued willingness to surprise, a way of proving that the agreement about the safety of the core cast could be broken at any time. The creator's tone in the aftermath was characteristically irreverent, and his remarks made clear that the permanence of the death had always been an illusion. He suggested, with a kind of mocking disbelief, that no one should have seriously believed the show would actually get rid of Brian for good, framing the very idea as absurd. In a more sentimental moment, he offered a tidy holiday moral, the lesson that people should never take their loved ones for granted, because they can be lost in an instant, turning the whole ordeal into a deliberate emotional exercise that had been planned to resolve exactly as it did. The grief the fans had felt, the petition they had signed, the tattoos some had gotten, had all been responses to a death the show had never intended to make stick. This raises a genuinely thorny question about the relationship between the show and its audience, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. On one reading, the stunt was a masterstroke. It generated enormous attention, dominated conversation for weeks, proved the depth of the audience's attachment, and reminded everyone that the show still had the power to provoke a real emotional reaction after more than a decade on the air. By that measure, it was an unqualified success, a piece of theater that worked precisely as intended. On another reading, the whole affair was a manipulation, a deliberate infliction of grief on devoted fans for the sake of buzz, with the knowledge from the very start that the pain was temporary and the loss was fake. The fans who cried, who signed, who inked their skin, had given something real in response to something the show always knew was not real. Whether that exchange was a clever bit of showmanship or a quiet betrayal of the audience's trust is a question on which reasonable viewers have landed in opposite places, and the show itself never seemed troubled by the tension. The Brian saga also stands out because of how rare it was for the show to put a core character in real danger at all. Across its long history, the program had killed off plenty of minor figures, including in its early earlier years, a memorable boss of Peter's who met a sudden end. Those deaths carried little weight because the characters were peripheral and easily spared. Brian was different. His death marked the first time the show had aimed its lethal impulse squarely at one of its central, beloved figures. The first time the danger felt genuine because the character at risk genuinely mattered. That is exactly why it landed so hard, and exactly why the show chose him. A stunt only works if the audience cares about the target, and the audience cared about Brian more than the show had quite realized. For a character so central, Brian carried a surprising amount of his own dramatic history even before his death, and that history deepens the picture of who the show was willing to gamble with. Years earlier, in an episode from the show's 6th season, Brian had been confronted with the discovery that he was the biological father of a teenage boy, a sullen son named Dylan he had never known about. The storyline gave the dog a genuine arc, forcing the self-absorbed bachelor to reckon with responsibility and fatherhood in a way that revealed the loneliness and arrested longing beneath his sophisticated surface. Brian, in other words, had long been the character the show reached for when it wanted to attempt something with actual emotional stakes. His death was, in a sense, the largest and boldest version of a thing the show had been doing with him all along, using the family dog as the vessel for its rare experiments in real feeling. For the generation that grew up with the show, the killing and resurrection of Brian occupies a peculiar place in memory. Many who watched it live can recall the genuine shock of the death, the disbelief that the show had actually done it, and then the swift relief of the return. Revisiting the saga as adults, with the creator's explanation now part of the record, the memory takes on a more complicated flavor. The grief that felt so pure in the moment is now known to have been aimed at a loss that was never going to last, and that knowledge changes the texture of the recollection. It becomes a memory not only of mourning a character, but of having been, in a sense, played, of having responded with real emotion to a piece of engineered drama. For some, that knowledge sours the whole affair. For others, it only deepens their respect for a show willing to manufacture such a powerful reaction. The deeper significance of the Brian episode reaches beyond the single character and points toward the strange architecture of the show's entire universe. Brian could be killed and then restored because the world of Family Guy contained, by this point, the tools to make such a thing possible. A baby with a time machine, a casual willingness to rewrite the past, an established sense that the timeline itself was something that could be altered, all of it stood ready to be used. The resurrection was not a miracle pulled from nowhere. It drew on rules the show had been quietly building for years, rules about time and about parallel worlds that gave the program a freedom almost no other sitcom possessed. To understand how a dog could die one week and live the next without the story collapsing, the larger machinery of that universe has to be examined directly. The multiverse and the time travel that turned death itself into something the show could take back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show killed its most beloved character, watched its fans pour out real grief, and then quietly admitted the loss had been a stunt all along, undone by a baby and a time machine. That casual rewriting of death was no accident. It was made possible by strange rules of time and parallel worlds the show had been building for years. Section 4. The rules of a broken universe. Every fictional world runs on rules, even the silly ones. A cartoon may bend the laws of physics for a joke, letting a character survive a fall that would flatten a real person. But underneath the gags, there is usually a quiet logic that the audience absorbs without thinking. Characters age or they do not. Events from past episodes are remembered or they are forgotten. The dead stay dead or they do not. These rules are rarely stated out loud, yet they shape everything, because they tell the audience what to take seriously and what to brush off. For most of its life, Family Guy operated on the loosest possible version of these rules, a world where almost anything could be undone and very little carried lasting weight. What makes the show genuinely strange, even among cartoons, is that at a certain point, it stopped leaving those rules unspoken and began building an actual cosmology, a real set of laws governing time and reality that gave the program a freedom few sitcoms have ever possessed. The first pillar of that cosmology concerns parallel worlds, and it was laid down in an episode that has become one of the most celebrated in the entire series. The installment opened the show's 8th season, aired in the autumn of 2009, and carried a title borrowed from the show's long tradition of adventure episodes, Road to the Multiverse. The premise is deceptively simple. Stewie, the infant genius, has built a device that allows the user to travel between alternate universes, and he brings Brian along to explore them. Before they set off, Stewie explains the idea behind the machine, laying out a theory that the episode then proceeds to take entirely seriously. The explanation Stewie offers is, in its own way, a genuine piece of speculative science folded into a cartoon. He describes a reality in which an infinite number of universes exist alongside our own, arranged on parallel planes, each one a version of reality where things have unfolded differently. In some of these worlds, the differences are tiny, a small detail altered here or there. In others, the differences are enormous, the whole shape of history bent in another direction. The core of the idea, as Stewie frames it, is that every possible outcome exists somewhere, that anything that could have happened has happened in some universe along the endless shelf of them. With that principle established, the device makes sense. It is a key to a building with infinite rooms, and each room holds a different version of everything. What the episode does with that key is where it becomes a feast of invention. Brian and Stewie hop from world to world, and each one is a fully imagined alternate reality. They visit a universe in which a certain major religion never took hold, which means the long period of scientific stagnation that the show jokingly blames on it never happened, leaving that world's humanity 1,000 years more advanced than our own, complete with a version of Meg who is, in that reality, considered beautiful. They land in a world drawn entirely in the soft, rounded style of classic family animation, where the familiar Quahog characters appear as gentle parodies of beloved cartoon figures. They pass through a universe rendered in deliberately crude, low-quality animation, a world built from the jerky style of stop motion, a reality where everyone has two heads, and a world transformed into the flat, ancient setting of a famous prehistoric cartoon. The episode treats the infinite multiverse as a playground, and the playfulness should not obscure the fact that, in doing so, it cemented the existence of parallel realities as a permanent feature of the show's universe. The journey ends in a world that matters for reasons beyond comedy. Brian and Stewie arrive in a reality where dogs are the dominant species and humans live as their pets, an inversion that Brian, the family dog, finds intoxicating. He becomes reluctant to leave, drawn to a world where his kind rules, and in the course of the conflict that follows, the device that carries them between universes is broken. The detail seems small, a plot mechanism to raise the stakes, but it plants an idea that the show would return to again and again. The doorway between worlds is real, it can be opened, and once opened it cannot always be easily closed. The multiverse was now part of the furniture of the show, available to be used whenever the writers wished. The second pillar of the cosmology concerns time, and it is even more consequential than the first, because it is the pillar that makes death itself negotiable. Stewie, in addition to his interdimensional device, is established across the series as the builder of a working time machine, a device he uses in multiple episodes to travel into the past and the future. The existence of a functioning time machine in the hands of a character who appears in nearly every episode quietly transforms the rules of the entire show. Nothing that happens is truly final, because the past is no longer fixed. Any event, including the worst ones, sits within reach of a baby who can simply go back and arrange for it never to have occurred. The episode that explored this power most fully reached all the way back to the show's own beginning. In an installment built around the time machine, Stewie and Brian travel into the past and arrive on the very day of the show's first episode, stepping into the world of the pilot. The conceit is delightful on its surface, a chance for the characters to encounter their younger, rougher selves, and to poke fun at how the show used to look. Beneath the comedy, though, the episode does something with real weight. The travelers meddle with the past, and their meddling alters the course of history, spinning out a chain of consequences that reshapes the future they came from into something dark and broken. They are then forced to undertake a frantic effort to repair the damage and restore the timeline to its proper shape. The lesson embedded in the story is unmistakable. Time in this universe is not a one-way river. It is a thread that can be pulled, tangled, and rewoven, and the characters possess the means to do the pulling. Once both pillars are standing, the multiverse and the malleable timeline, the architecture of the entire show clicks into a new and revealing shape. Consider again the death and resurrection of the family dog. When Brian was killed and then brought back through the intervention of a time-traveling Stewie, the resurrection was not a cheat pulled from thin air. It was simply the application of a rule the show had already established years earlier. The time machine existed. The ability to alter the past was canon. The grieving Stewie reaching for that power to undo a death was the universe behaving exactly according to its own laws. What looked to an outraged fan like a shameless reversal was, within the logic the show had carefully built, a perfectly consistent event. The broken universe had been designed, intentionally or not, to make exactly that kind of rescue possible. The cosmology also reaches into the very makeup of the family, and the strangest example of this involves a character born from one of the show's most absurd pieces of canon. Stewie, across the series, has a recurring nemesis, an evil infant named Bertram, a baby as brilliant and as malevolent as Stewie himself. The origin of this rival is where the show's casual relationship with biology becomes almost dizzying. Bertram exists because, at some point in the show's backstory, Peter donated to a sperm bank, and Bertram is the result of that donation, carried by a different mother. This makes the villainous baby, by the show's own logic, a biological half-brother to Stewie, the two of them sharing Peter as a father, despite belonging to entirely different households. A throwaway gag about a man's visit to a clinic had been spun into a permanent piece of family lore, complete with a recurring antagonist tied to the Griffins by blood. Bertram does not merely exist as a piece of trivia, he becomes an active player in the show's time-bending mythology. In one of his most notable schemes, the rival baby uses time travel himself, traveling into the distant past with the aim of murdering one of the family's ancestors, a plan that, if successful, would erase Stewie from existence entirely by removing one of the links in his bloodline. Stewie must pursue him through history to stop the plot and protect his own future. The story is pure cartoon spectacle, yet it reinforces the deep rules of the universe one more time. The past is a battlefield. Bloodlines can be threatened across centuries. The timeline is a thing characters fight over, because in this world, the timeline is something that can actually be changed, with consequences that ripple forward into the present. Taken together, these elements add up to a universe with a remarkable property, one that sets it apart from the ordinary sitcoms it superficially resembles. In a normal comedy, continuity is a cage. Once a character dies or a major event occurs, the writers are stuck with it, bound by the history they have created. Family Guy, by formally establishing both infinite parallel worlds and a rewritable timeline, freed itself from that cage almost completely. Anything that happens can be undone by going back in time. Any version of any character can be summoned from a parallel world. Any continuity error can be waved away as the difference between one universe and another. The show built itself an escape hatch from the very concept of consequence, and that escape hatch is a large part of why it has been able to do so many wild and contradictory things across so many years without ever quite breaking. There is a quiet cost buried in this freedom, and it is worth naming honestly. A world where nothing is permanent is also a world where nothing is fully at stake. When the audience knows, somewhere in the back of its mind, that any death can be reversed and any disaster can be rewritten, it becomes harder for any single event to carry real weight. The very tools that let the show resurrect a beloved character also drain some of the tension from every future peril, because the means of undoing everything are always sitting right there in Stewie's lab. The show traded permanence for flexibility, and flexibility is a powerful thing for a comedy that wants to keep surprising people, but it comes at the price of a certain kind of seriousness that a more bounded world can offer. The brief flash of genuine grief over Brian's death was, in part, so striking precisely because it briefly made the audience forget the escape hatch existed. The loose architecture also explains the show's famously relaxed attitude toward its own contradiction. Over the years, Family Guy has told conflicting versions of how Peter and Lois met, how Peter makes his money, and countless other details of its history, with the facts shifting from episode to episode in ways that would drive a careful continuity keeper to despair. In most shows, this would read as sloppiness. In a show that has formally declared the existence of infinite parallel realities, the contradictions become almost defensible. The natural noise of a universe with infinite versions of everything. The cosmology the show built did not only enable its grand experiments, it quietly excused its small inconsistencies as well, turning what might have been flaws into features of a deliberately unstable reality. For the generation that grew up with the show, the multiverse and time travel episodes often stand out as the moments when the program felt most ambitious, most willing to reach beyond the rhythm of cutaway jokes into something larger and stranger. A young viewer watching Brian and Stewie leap between worlds, or travel back to the day the show began, was being offered a kind of imaginative scope that a typical family comedy never attempted. Revisiting those episodes later, with a fuller understanding of how they function as the load-bearing rules of the entire series, can deepen the appreciation considerably. The wild adventures were not only spectacle, they were the show quietly writing the laws that would govern everything else. The constitution of a universe designed to let its characters cheat death and rewrite history whenever the story required it. The deepest truth of this broken universe is that it gave the show a power most programs would envy and few would know how to handle: the power to take anything back. That power shaped how the show could treat its characters, its continuity, and even its own mistakes. There was, however, one kind of consequence that no time machine could undo and no parallel world could escape: a force that operated entirely outside the show's fictional reality and answered to no cosmology the writers could invent. When the show reached too far into subjects the real world was not willing to laugh at, it discovered a hard limit that no amount of imaginary science could rewrite. The moment a finished episode was simply locked away and forbidden from ever reaching the people who wanted to see it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Infinite parallel worlds and a rewritable timeline gave the show the power to undo any death and excuse any contradiction, an escape hatch from consequence itself. Yet there was one force no time machine could touch. Out in the real world, certain finished episodes were judged too dangerous to air and locked away where no audience could reach them. Section 5. The episode's Fox buried. A thing that is never made leaves no trace. It exists only as an idea that died in someone's head, and the world never misses it because the world never knew it. Far stranger and far rarer is the thing that is fully made and then hidden, the finished work locked in a drawer, complete in every detail yet forbidden from ever being seen. A half hour of animation is the product of many months of labor and a great deal of money, written, recorded, drawn, scored, and polished into a final form. To carry all of that work to completion and then refuse to show it to anyone is an extraordinary act, an admission that the program has produced something its own keepers are afraid of. Family Guy, the show that prided itself on having no limits, turned out to have a small vault of exactly these forbidden things, episodes too dangerous for the network that paid for them. The earliest of the buried episodes reaches back to the show's third season and to a premise built on one of the oldest and ugliest stereotypes aimed at Jewish people. The episode carries the title title When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and its story has Peter, frustrated by his own hopeless handling of the family finances, decide that what he needs is a Jewish person to take charge of his money, because he has swallowed the prejudice that Jewish people possess some natural genius for it. He seeks out a Jewish man for help, and even hopes to steer his son toward Judaism in the belief that it will make the boy more successful. The entire engine of the episode is a centuries-old slander, dressed up as the foolish confusion of a dim father. The network looked at the finished episode and grew frightened. Reading the script and watching the result, the executives worried that audiences would receive it as genuinely anti-Semitic rather than as a satire of anti-Semitism. And around the year 2000, they chose to hold it back rather than let it air on schedule. The episode sat completed but unseen, a finished installment with nowhere to go. Its eventual escape came through a side door, a late-night cartoon block aimed at adults broadcasted a few years later, in 2003, and only after that did the original network finally air it as well, in 2004, apparently deciding that enough time had passed for the danger to fade. The episode also reached fans through home video. The Weinstein story then represents the gentler form of burial, a temporary hold rather than a permanent ban, an episode delayed and rerouted before finding its way to the light. The second buried episode is harder, and it stands as the show's true forbidden installment, the one that was never permitted to air on the network at all. The episode belongs to the 8th season and bears the title Partial Terms of Endearment. Its subject was the single most divisive issue in American public life, the question of abortion, and the story approached that subject with surprising directness for a comedy. Lois agrees to serve as a surrogate mother for an old college friend and the friend's husband, carrying a child for the couple who cannot have one themselves. The plan turns tragic when the couple are killed in a sudden accident, leaving Lois alone with a pregnancy and an agonizing decision about whether to continue it. Around that heavy premise, the show builds its comedy, sending Peter swinging wildly through the politics of the issue. While the central choice is treated with a weight the show rarely allowed itself, the network refused to broadcast this one under any arrangement, and the refusal was unusually complete. The decision was made before the 8th season even reached the air, and the show's team shared the news of the ban publicly with fans at a major fan convention. The door was not merely closed at the main network. Even the permissive late-night cartoon block that had rescued the Weinstein episode years earlier declined to air this one, doing so at the request of the original network. Both the broadcaster and its most tolerant sibling channel had shut the same half-hour out, leaving the episode without a home anywhere on American television. The reasoning came down to the collision of subject and tone. A comedic treatment of abortion risked enraging vast numbers of viewers across every side of the question, along with the advertisers who feared being dragged into the controversy. The episode did not vanish entirely, and the ways it survived reveal how much these decisions depend on the particular fears of a particular market. Across the ocean, a major British broadcaster aired it without hesitation in an ordinary late evening slot, treating it as a normal episode and reaching a large audience that received it, by most accounts, warmly. The same work that one country found too dangerous to show was, in another, simply a well-liked installment of a popular cartoon. Within the United States, the episode found its only home on home video, released so that fans willing to seek it out could finally watch the thing their own network had refused them. The show's creator reflected on the ban with notable calm, suggesting that he had understood the network's position from the start, and that the comedic framing of such a grave subject was what truly doomed it, since a serious drama handling the same material would likely have been allowed to proceed. The precise contours of streaming availability for this episode have shifted over the years and are not settled at every moment, so it is fair to describe the long stretch of its absence rather than claim certainty about its status today. The third buried episode was not pulled because of what the writers intended at all, but because of a real tragedy that arrived after the fact and gave the material a horrifying new resonance. The episode belongs to the 11th season and carries the title Turban Cowboy. Its plot has Peter befriend a Muslim man and grow close to him, only to discover that his new friend is an extremist involved in plotting violence, a story that leans on the damaging stereotype linking Muslim identity with terrorism. The episode aired without extraordinary incident at first. What changed everything was an event in the real world. Not long after a deadly bombing at a major American marathon, an edited clip drawn from the episode began spreading online, stitched together in a misleading way that falsely suggested the show had somehow made light of that specific attack. The clip was a distortion, an assembly of altered material presented as though it were a single coherent scene, and it created a false impression that the show had mocked a real and recent atrocity. The reaction was swift. The episode was pulled from the network's online platforms, removed from circulation, and the show's creator publicly described the use of his work in connection with the bombing as abhorrent, rejecting the false impression the doctored clip had created. The precise mechanics of how the clip was assembled and how widely it traveled are recounted with varying confidence across the public record, so the honest version is to name plainly that the viral version was misleading rather than to treat the impression it left as true. This was a different kind of burial from the first two. The episode was not hidden because of a judgment made before airing, but withdrawn afterward, caught in the wake of a real real horror it had never been about. Beyond the episodes that were buried whole, the show carried within its ordinary canon a set of moments dark enough to draw organized protest, and one of the most notorious lived in a cheerful song from the 4th season. In an episode centered on the neighbors, the show staged a scene in which a man receives the news that he has a fatal illness, and rather than delivering this news with any gravity, the show has Peter arrive with a full barbershop quartet to sing the diagnosis to him in a bright and bouncy musical number. The joke lived entirely in the obscene gap between the jaunty melody and the devastating message it carried. By the account of the show's own creative team, recorded in commentary, the tastelessness was the deliberate point. The result was exactly what they had courted. Organizations devoted to people living with the illness protested the number, and watchdog groups would point to material like it for years as evidence of how far the show was willing to go. The song was not buried, yet it sits in the same dark territory as the forbidden episodes, a piece of canon that even many fans found difficult to defend. The darkness was not confined to one-off shock moments either. It reached into the permanent fabric of the characters, written into who they are at a level the show never took back. The clearest example involves the family dog and a single quiet episode that stripped away the comedy almost entirely. In an installment built around only Brian and Stewie, with none of the usual cutaways to lighten it, the show let the two characters simply talk, and in that stillness, Brian revealed something genuinely heavy. He admitted to keeping a means of ending his own life, and to taking a strange comfort in knowing that an exit existed, a confession all the more striking because it came from the character written as the family's sophisticated voice of reason. The moment treated real despair with a seriousness the show almost never permitted itself, and it remains one of the most sobering things in the entire run. A reminder that beneath the dog's worldly wit, the writers had quietly placed a deep and aching loneliness. This is a heavy corner of the show, handled by the writers with unusual care, and it is worth approaching gently rather than as just another shock. Other pieces of dark canon are stranger than they are sad, written into the family in ways that the show treated as simple fact. The youngest member of the household, the infant genius, was established early on as carrying a streak of masochism, a trait the show returned to in more than one episode, played for uncomfortable comedy rather than for any deeper meaning. The neighbor Quagmire, the relentless airline pilot, was given a piece of permanent backstory when an 8th season episode introduced his father, a character who comes out as a transgender woman over the course of the story and takes the name Ida. That development became part of the canon, a permanent fact of the show's world, even as the episode that introduced it built much of its humor on confusion and discomfort in ways that have aged into one of the show's most criticized half-hours. These details, woven into the characters and left to stand, show how the show's appetite for the dark and the transgressive was never confined to special episodes. It lived in the ordinary DNA of the cast. The pattern across all of these buried and darkened pieces reveals something important about the limits the show actually faced. For all its talk of fearlessness, for all the imaginary power it had granted itself to undo any death and rewrite any history, the show ran into hard walls that no fictional cosmology could move. A time machine could reverse a character's death, but it could do nothing about a network refusing to air an episode. The infinite multiverse could excuse any contradiction, but it could not bring a forbidden installment back from the vault. The forces that buried these episodes were entirely real. The fears of advertisers, the anger of communities, the weight of a genuine tragedy, and against forces like those, the show's imaginary toolkit was useless. The vault represents the show meeting the one kind of consequence it could never escape. There is a quiet irony in a program built on the boast of having no boundaries, discovering, again and again, exactly where its boundaries lay. The show that would say anything had within its own history a small collection of things it had been forbidden to say, finished works sealed away precisely because they had reached too far. For fans, these buried episodes took on a peculiar glamour. A forbidden installment becomes a thing to be hunted down and watched precisely because it was forbidden, and the bands that were meant to contain the show ended up feeding its legend. The vault that was supposed to be an embarrassment became, in the eyes of the audience, a badge of the show's daring. For the generation that grew up with the show, the buried episodes occupy a strange and almost mythical place in memory. Many fans knew, in a vague way, that there were episodes one was not supposed to be able to see, installments whispered about and traded and sought after. The abortion episode that never aired at home, the anti-Semitism episode that vanished for years, the terrorism episode pulled in the wake of horror. To learn the full stories behind them, to understand exactly why each one was buried and how each one survived, is to see the outer edge of what even the most boundary-pushing show was permitted to do. The vault marks the place where the show's imagination ran into the immovable reality of networks, advertisers, communities, and tragedy. All of this, the buried episodes, the dark canon, the deaths and resurrections, the infinite universes, belongs to what the show actually did, the documented record of choices made by real writers in a real room. There is, however, another body of material that surrounds the show, built not by its creators, but by its audience, and it goes to places far darker than anything the writers ever put on screen. The fans, staring at the strange and contradictory world of Quahog, began to construct their own explanations for it, theories that reach beneath the comedy to find something haunting underneath. The first and most famous of these theories series proposes that the entire cheerful world of the show is a lie, a bright illusion painted over a grief too terrible to face. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show that boasted of no limits kept a small vault of forbidden episodes and wrote real darkness into the very bones of its characters. That is the record of what the writers actually did. What the fans built on top of it goes somewhere far darker, beginning with the theory that the whole bright world is a grieving man's illusion. Section 6. It's all inside Peter's head. People cannot help looking for the dark thing underneath. Show an audience a bright and cheerful surface for long enough, and some portion of that audience will begin to wonder what the brightness is hiding, will start to feel that no world can really be as light as it pretends to be. There is a deep human instinct at work here, the same instinct that hears a happy song and listens for the sadness in it, that meets a smiling person and senses the weight behind the smile. Cartoons, with their candy colors and their endless resilience, are especially prone to this kind of suspicion. The brighter and sillier a show appears, the more tempting it becomes to imagine that the silliness is a mask. Of all the theories that fans have built around Family Guy, none follows this instinct further into the dark than the one that proposes the entire show is a lie told by a broken mind. Before going any further, it is worth being completely clear about what this is. The idea that follows is a fan theory and nothing more. It was never written by the show's creators, never confirmed by anyone involved in making the program, and never presented on screen as the truth of the world. It is a piece of speculation built entirely by the audience, an interpretation laid over the show from the outside. The show's actual canon, the documented history explored in earlier chapters, runs against this theory in several places. Keeping that firmly in mind matters, because the power of the theory comes precisely from how convincingly it can be argued, despite having no official standing at all. The theory first surfaced on a large online forum devoted to fan speculation, posted by an anonymous user around the year 2012. For a long while, it lived quietly in the corners of the internet, where this kind of dark reinterpretation circulates, passed between fans who enjoyed the chill it produced. Then, roughly a decade later, in the final months of 2022, it found a second and far larger life on a popular short video app, where users began urging one another to look it up, passing it along as something genuinely disturbing, a piece of hidden darkness waiting to be discovered. The theory spread rapidly through that new audience, many of whom encountered it as a kind of creepy dare, and it cemented its place as the most famous dark reading the show has ever attracted. The story the theory tells is bleak from its first step, and it rewrites the entire family in the language of tragedy. According to the theory, the real Griffin family was nothing like the one shown on screen. In this imagined true version of events, Meg was not the dismissed and ridiculed daughter the show presents. She was a popular and lovely young woman, well-liked and full of promise. Chris was not a goofy teenager, but a boy with a genuine developmental disability, the result, in the theory's telling, of a loss of oxygen during his birth. The family, in this hidden history, was an ordinary one carrying ordinary love, before a single night destroyed it. The catastrophe at the center of the theory is a car accident. As the theory describes it, Meg took her brother Chris to a party one night, and on the way home, a drunk driving crash killed them both. The loss of two children at once is the kind of blow few families could survive intact, and in this telling, the Griffins did not survive it. Lois, the theory continues, was pregnant at the time, carrying the child who would have been Stewie, and the grief of losing her two children proved unbearable. In the theory's account, she took her own life while still carrying that unborn child, compounding the original tragedy with a further and even more devastating one. This is heavy ground, and the theory walks through it without flinching, which is part of why it unsettles people so deeply. What remained, according to the theory, was Peter, alone with a grief too enormous to hold. The mind, faced with a loss it cannot survive, sometimes builds a wall of fantasy to hide behind, and the theory proposes that this is exactly what Peter's mind did. Unable to live in a world where his family was gone, he constructed an alternate reality inside his own head, a heightened and cartoonish version of the life he had lost, and the entire show is that fantasy playing out. The bright colors, the absurd adventures, the family gathered around the dinner table, all of it is, in this reading, the elaborate dream of a man who cannot accept that everyone he loved is dead. The theory becomes genuinely clever in how it uses the details of the show as evidence for this hidden grief, turning familiar features of the program into symptoms of Peter's broken mind. The cruel treatment of Meg, one of the show's most persistent and uncomfortable running jokes, is reframed as the expression of Peter's buried resentment. In the theory's logic, some part of Peter blames his daughter for the crash that killed her and her brother, and so in his fantasy he punishes her endlessly, making her the target of the family's contempt as a way of working out a guilt and anger he cannot face directly. A pattern that the show plays for laughs becomes, under the theory, the slow leak of a father's grief poisoning the dream he built to escape it. Stewie receives a similar reinterpretation, and it may be the most affecting piece of the whole theory. The unborn child who never got to live is reimagined in Peter's fantasy as a baby of extraordinary genius, brilliant beyond all reason. The theory reads this as the projection of a grieving parent's hopes, a father imagining that the son he lost before birth would have possessed limitless potential, making making the dream child a prodigy because the real child never had the chance to become anything at all. The theory goes further still, pointing to Stewie's well-known hostility toward his mother as another encoded piece of the tragedy. In the fantasy, the baby resents Lois because, in the hidden true story, her death is the reason the child never got to be born. A grudge the show plays as a recurring comedic bit becomes, in this reading, the dream logic of a man processing the most painful loss imaginable. Even Peter's own famous foolishness is folded into the theory. The character's childlike simplicity, his cartoonish stupidity, his tendency to behave like an overgrown infant, are read not as mere comedy, but as the regression of a mind that has retreated from an unbearable reality into something simpler and safer. A man who cannot cope with the full weight of adult grief, the theory suggests, has receded into a childlike state, and the show's portrayal of Peter as a buffoon is the outward sign of that inward collapse. Nearly every distinctive feature of the program, in the hands of this theory, becomes a clue pointing back to the same central wound. The reason the theory works as well as it does, despite having no official basis whatsoever, lies in how neatly it explains things the show itself never bothered to justify. Why do the Griffins survive injuries and disasters that would kill any real person, walking away unharmed from catastrophes episode after episode? Because, the theory answers, none of it is real, and a dream has no need to obey the rules of life and death. Why does the show feel free to be so absurd, so detached from consequence, so willing to do anything for a laugh? Because a fantasy built by a grieving mind is unbound by reality, free to be as ridiculous as it needs to be to keep the pain at bay. The very qualities that make the show what it is, its invulnerability, its absurdity, its refusal to be tied down, all find a tidy explanation in the theory. That tidiness is seductive, and it is a large part of why the idea has spread so far. Honesty requires turning the theory over and examining where it falls apart, because it does fall apart when pressed against the show's actual canon. The documented history of the program directly contradicts several of the theory's load-bearing claims. The show has built entire episodes around Stewie's conception and birth, treating him as a genuine member of the family with a real origin rather than as the imagined ghost of an unborn child. The existence of Stewie's biological half-brother, the product of a clinic donation explored in an earlier chapter, ties Stewie to a wider canon that the grief theory cannot easily accommodate. The show's established machinery of time travel and parallel worlds offers its own internal explanations for the survival and absurdity that the theory attributes to fantasy. A viewer who knows the canon well can dismantle the theory point by point, and many have, and yet the theory persists, and its persistence says something worth pausing over. A fan theory does not survive for more than a decade and spread to millions of new viewers because it is airtight. It survives because it offers something the literal show does not: a sense of hidden depth, a feeling that the silly cartoon contains a secret sorrow, a way of taking a program often dismissed as crude and lazy, and finding in it an unexpected emotional weight. The theory is, in a sense, a gift the audience gave the show, an act of imaginative generosity that reads tragedy into comedy and meaning into mayhem. That the show never intended any of it does not diminish the appeal. If anything, the gap between the show's flippant surface and the theory's profound sadness is exactly what makes the idea so haunting. There is also a quieter reason the theory resonates, one rooted in how grief actually works rather than in anything specific to the show. The idea that a person might build an entire cheerful world to avoid facing an unbearable loss touches something true about the human mind. People do construct walls against pain. People do retreat into comforting illusion. People do, in their own smaller ways, paint brightness over wounds they cannot look at directly. The theory takes that real and recognizable human behavior and projects it onto a cartoon, and in doing so, it lets the audience contemplate something genuinely sad through the safe distance of a fictional family. The chill it produces is the chill of recognizing, in an absurd cartoon, a shape that resembles real human suffering. For the generation that grew up with the show, the grief theory has a particular power, because it asks them to look again at something they have known since childhood and to see it as something else entirely. A person who watched these episodes as a carefree child, laughing at Peter's antics and the family's chaos, is invited by the theory to revisit those same episodes as an adult and to imagine a terrible sadness beneath every joke. The reframing is irreversible in a way. Once a viewer has encountered the theory, it becomes difficult to watch certain moments, the cruelty toward Meg, the baby's hatred of his mother, without the dark reading flickering somewhere in the back of the mind, even knowing full well that the show never meant any of it. The theory installs a shadow, and the shadow lingers. The grief theory is the purest example of a particular kind of fan creativity, the impulse to find a single dark key that unlocks an entire show, to discover the one hidden tragedy that makes everything else make sense. It is almost certainly false as a matter of canon, contradicted by the show's own documented history, never endorsed by anyone who made the program. As a piece of folklore built by the audience, though, it is a genuine achievement, a story compelling enough to outlive the decade of its birth and to frighten a whole new generation of viewers. It transforms a comedy into a tragedy through nothing more than the force of interpretation, and it stands as proof of how much meaning an audience can pour into into a show that never asked for any. This first dark theory locates its tragedy inside a single mind, imagining the whole show as one man's grief. The next major theory the fans constructed takes a very different approach to explaining the show's strangeness. Rather than collapsing everything into one character's broken psyche, it looks at how dramatically the show itself changed over the years, at how the characters seem to transform into harsher versions of themselves, and it reaches for the show's own established science to argue that the program the world watched after its resurrection was, quite literally, taking place in a different universe altogether. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The most famous dark theory paints the whole bright world as one grieving father's illusion, false in canon, yet impossible to forget once heard. The next theory explains the show's strangeness in a stranger way still. It argues the meaner, wilder show that returned after cancellation was never the same world at all. Section 7. Two different universes. Anyone who has gone back to a place they loved long ago knows the strange ache of finding it changed. The town looks almost right, the streets run where they always did, the buildings stand more or less where memory placed them, and yet something is off. Some quality of the thing has shifted in a way that is hard to name. The people seem different. The mood has soured or sharpened. It is recognizably the same place, and somehow it is not the same place at all. Long-running television produces this exact feeling in its most devoted viewers, the sense that a show they have followed for years has slowly become a stranger wearing a familiar face. Few shows produce it more strongly than Family Guy, and a group of its fans found that the ordinary explanations would not satisfy them, so they reached for a stranger one, drawn from the show's own science, and argued that the program had not merely changed. It had been replaced by a version of itself from another universe. This theory, like the one before it, belongs entirely to the audience, and that fact deserves to be stated clearly before anything else. No one who makes the show has ever suggested that its different eras take place in different universes. The idea is a piece of fan interpretation, an attempt to explain a real and noticeable change in the show by means of a clever reading, rather than by the simpler truth that writers and tastes change over time. What makes this particular theory interesting is that, unlike the grief theory, it does not contradict the show's canon at all. Instead, it borrows the canon, takes the multiverse the show itself established, and turns that established science into the engine of its argument. The change the theory sets out to explain is real, and any longtime viewer can feel it. The Family Guy of its earliest seasons was a different animal from the Family Guy that returned after its cancellation and revival. The early show, for all its provocations, was a touch gentler in its rhythms, more grounded in something resembling ordinary family life, its characters operating with a bit more restraint. The show that came back, as discussed earlier in this story, was meaner and bolder, its humor darker, its characters pushed toward extremes. Over the long years that followed, that push only intensified, until the family on screen seemed at times like exaggerated cartoons of their former selves, each one reduced more and more to a single amplified trait. Fans and critics have a name for this kind of slow transformation, borrowed from a character on another famous animated show whose personality narrowed over time into a single defining quirk. The process describes what happens when a character who once had a rounded, complicated personality is gradually flattened, season after season, into an exaggerated version of one trait, until the rich figure of the early years becomes a broad caricature. Peter, who began as a dim but recognizably human father, drifted toward becoming a creature of pure chaotic stupidity. Lois, once the grounded center of the family, took on harder and stranger edges. Across the cast, the same flattening occurred, the early subtlety giving way to louder and simpler versions of each character. Most people, encountering this change, explain it in the ordinary way. Shows evolve, writing staffs turn over, the pressure to keep a long-running comedy fresh pushes the humor toward bigger and broader extremes. Audiences themselves change, and the things that shocked or delighted in one decade grow stale in the next, forcing the show to escalate. These are perfectly reasonable explanations, grounded in the simple reality of how television gets made. The fans behind this theory, though, were not satisfied with the ordinary explanation. They wanted the change to mean something within the world of the show itself, and the show had handed them exactly the tool they needed to provide it. That tool was the multiverse, established as canon in the celebrated episode explored earlier, the one in which the show declared that infinite parallel realities exist, each holding a different version of everything. Once the show had officially placed itself inside a multiverse, a door swung open that the fans were quick to walk through. If infinite versions of the Griffin family exist across infinite parallel worlds, then the theory could propose something audacious. The meaner, wilder family of the later seasons was not the same family that had been canceled years earlier. It was a different version of the Griffs, from a different universe, a harsher reality that the show had somehow slipped into during the years it was off the air. The early Griffins and the late Griffins were, by this reading, two distinct families separated by the wall between worlds. The theory finds its most ingenious support in another canon episode, the time travel story in which Stewie and Brian journey back to the day of the show's first installment. On its surface, that episode is straightforward time travel, the characters visiting their their own past. The theory offers a sly reinterpretation. What if the two of them did not travel back in time at all? What if instead they crossed into a parallel universe, specifically the original universe, the gentler world of the early seasons, which exists alongside the harsher world they now inhabit? Under this reading, the episode is secretly a multiverse story rather than a time travel one, a brief visit by the late season characters to the earlier and kinder reality from which they had become separated. The episode that seems to confirm the show's continuity becomes, in the theory's hands, evidence that the continuity was broken long ago. Some fans push the idea even further, past the simple split between two eras, and into something far more radical. Why stop at two universes? This extended version asks. Given how wildly the show contradicts itself from episode to episode, given how often its own facts refuse to line up, perhaps the entire series is a multiverse, with each individual episode taking place in its own slightly different reality. The inconsistencies that have always plagued the show, the shifting accounts of how Peter earns his living, the contradictory versions of his heritage, the different stories of how he and Lois first met, all of these stop being errors under this reading and become natural features of a program that hops between universes every time the credits roll. The viewer, in this version of the theory, is carried to a new reality with each new episode, which is why nothing ever quite matches up. One particularly imaginative branch of this idea tried to tie the scattered universes together through Peter himself, proposing that all these parallel Peters are linked by a kind of shared mind, a single consciousness distributed across the infinite versions of the character. This would explain, the theory suggests, why Peter's history in particular is so hopelessly disjointed, since his memories and his nature are smeared across countless realities at once. The idea is wild, almost beyond reckoning, and its proponents know it, but it shows how far fans were willing to follow the logic once the show had given them a multiverse to play in. The contradictions that frustrated ordinary viewers became, for these theorists, a puzzle to be solved with ever grander cosmological machinery. A related theory took a darker and more grounded approach to the same problem, setting aside parallel universes in favor of trauma. Rather than explaining the harshening of the characters as a leap between worlds, this version argued that the whole neighborhood of Quahog gradually changed because its residents had been shaped and damaged by the events of their own lives. By this reading, the cast did not become meaner because they were swapped for alternate versions, but because the accumulated weight of their experiences slowly molded an ordinary community into a darker, more destructive, more dysfunctional one. The show, under this interpretation, becomes a long and unintentional study of how people curdle over time, how a seemingly normal town can sour into something troubled when its people are worn down by what they endure. This sibling theory reaches a similar destination by a different road, treating the show's tonal decline as the visible result of damage rather than as the sign of a universe swap. What unites all of these theories is the impulse behind them, and that impulse is worth understanding because it reveals something tender about how fans relate to the things they love. The people who built these theories were, in a sense, trying to make peace with disappointment. Many longtime viewers genuinely preferred the earlier, subtler version of the show, and watching it transform into something louder and harsher was a quiet loss, the slow fading of a thing they had loved in its original form. The two universes theory offers a strange kind of comfort in the face of that loss. If the gentler early show exists in its own separate universe, then it has not been destroyed or overwritten. It is still out there, perfectly preserved in its own reality, untouched by everything that came after. The theory lets fans keep the version they loved by placing it safely in another world. The honest assessment of these theories is that they are, as explanations of why the show actually changed, almost certainly wrong, and wrong in a way the fans themselves largely understand. The real reasons for the transformation are the mundane ones, the turnover of writers, the pressure to escalate, the simple drift of a long-running comedy toward broader humor. No parallel universe is required to explain why a show that ran for decades came to feel different from how it began. The theories are not serious attempts at literal truth so much as they are creative games, ways of engaging more deeply with the show by treating its flaws as mysteries and its inconsistencies as clues. They are play, dressed in the language of cosmology, and yet there is a real cleverness in them that deserves respect because they are built on a genuine foundation that the show itself provided. Unlike a theory pulled entirely from thin air, the two universes idea rests on canon the show actually established. The multiverse is real within the world of the show. The time travel episode does exist and can be read in more than one way. The tonal change between eras is undeniable. The theory takes these true things and assembles them into a coherent, if unintended, explanation, and the result holds together more snugly than it has any right to. It is the kind of theory that makes a person pause, because every piece of it points to something genuinely present in the show, even if the conclusion drawn from those pieces was never intended. For the generation that grew up with the show, watching it change across their own lives, the two universes theory carries a particular emotional charge. A person who started watching as a child and kept watching into adulthood lived through the entire transformation, experiencing the gentler early years and the harsher later ones fans as chapters of their own viewing life. For such a viewer, the idea that the early show survives intact in its own universe is genuinely consoling, a way of holding on to a version of the program that matches their earliest memories of it. The theory speaks to the strange grief of watching something you love grow into something you recognize less, and it offers, through the language of parallel worlds, a way to keep the original safe. These first two dark theories share a common shape in that both reach outward to explain the show as a whole, one through grief and one through cosmology. The next major theory the fans constructed turns inward instead, focusing not on the entire universe of the show, but on a single character, and it makes a quietly radical claim about him. It proposes that one member of the family is not merely living inside the show, but is secretly the author of it, the hidden hand writing every episode from within, and that his slow decline across the years tells a darker story than anyone watching ever realized. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Fans turned the show's own multiverse into a theory that its gentler early self still survives, untouched, in a separate world. The next theory narrows its gaze to a single character. It claims the family dog is secretly writing the entire show, and that his unraveling across the seasons hides a grim meaning. Section 8. Brian is writing all of it. Every story has an author, a hidden hand arranging events from somewhere outside the frame, and most of the time the audience never thinks about that hand at all. The author is supposed to be invisible, standing behind the curtain, pulling the strings without ever stepping into view. But what if the author were hiding not outside the story, but inside it, disguised as one of the characters, quietly steering everything while pretending to be just another resident of the world? A group of fans came to believe that Family Guy contains exactly such a hidden author, and that the audience has been watching him for years without realizing what he is. The secret writer, by this theory, is the family dog. As with the theories before it, this one is pure fan invention, never confirmed by anyone who makes the show, and never presented on screen as the truth. It is a reading laid over the program from the outside, a game of interpretation rather than a piece of canon. What gives it its strange appeal is how much of the show's actual design seems, once the theory is in mind, to support it. The starting point is Brian's role within the family. Across the entire run, Brian is written as the voice of reason, the one character who steps back from the chaos to comment on it, to judge it, to point out the foolishness of everyone around him. He is the intellectual of the household, the one who reads books and quotes philosophy, and looks down on the crude appetites of the people he lives with. The theory seizes on this, a character who functions as the calm narrator of the madness. The figure who always seems to be standing slightly apart and observing, behaves exactly as an author might behave if an author were secretly embedded in his own story. Brian watches, Brian comments, Brian shapes the meaning of events. That is what writers do. The theory's strongest piece of evidence comes from the structure of the show itself, from a pattern that careful viewers have long noticed. Family Guy frequently produces episodes that do not feature the whole family, smaller stories built around just a character or two. The striking thing is that these stripped-down episodes almost always include Brian. When the show narrows its focus, when it sets aside the broad ensemble for something more intimate, the dog is nearly always present, often paired with Stewie for one of their many two-handed adventures. The theory reads this as a tell. If Brian were merely one character among many, there would be no reason for him to appear in so many of the show's smaller stories. But if Brian were the author, the one writing the events from within, then of course he would write himself into everything, because an author is always present in his own work, the constant point of view through which the story is told. Brian's canon biography only deepens the case, because the show established from early on that Brian is, in fact, a writer. He is an aspiring novelist who has spent years laboring over a book that never seems to get finished, a manuscript he carries around and talks about and never quite completes. He fancies himself a serious literary mind, a thwarted artist trapped in a town of fools who cannot appreciate him. For a theory that casts him as the secret author of the entire show, this is almost too perfect. The character the show explicitly defines as a frustrated writer, forever trying and failing to produce his great work, is reimagined by the theory as the author whose great work is the show itself, the masterpiece he is secretly composing all along even as his fictional novel goes nowhere. There is a melancholy elegance to this reading, and it is part of why fans find it so satisfying. Brian, within the show, is something of a failure, a pretentious dog who never graduated, never finished his book, never became the great man he believes himself to be. The theory offers him a hidden triumph. The novel he could never complete does not matter, because his true creation is the world around him, the family and the town and every adventure they share. The character defined by his unrealized ambition becomes, in the theory, the quiet genius behind the entire program, his failure on the surface masking an extraordinary act of creation underneath. Running alongside this authorial theory is a second, darker idea about Brian, one that focuses not on what he secretly does, but on what slowly happens to him. Longtime viewers notice that Brian, over the years, seemed to grow less sharp. The character who began as the clever, sophisticated voice of reason gradually became more foolish, more self-deluded, more prone to the same stupidity he once mocked in others. His decline was subtle but real, a slow dimming flattening of the bright mind he started with. The ordinary explanation is the same flattening that affected the whole cast, the broad drift of a long-running show towards simpler characters. But one fan reading offered a far more pointed and unsettling explanation, rooted in something the show itself had always shown. Brian, from the beginning, is an alcoholic. He is rarely without a drink, forever nursing a martini, his dependence treated by the show as one of his defining traits, and often played for laughs. The theory takes that established trait and follows it to its real-world conclusion. Alcoholism, sustained over many years, does genuine damage to the human brain, eroding the very faculties that make a mind sharp. The theory argues that Brian's intellectual decline across the seasons is not random flattening at all, but the faithful depiction of a brain slowly being damaged by decades of heavy drinking. The dog grows dumber by this reading because his mind is being eaten away by the bottle, his wires crossing and his clarity fading exactly as the disease would predict. What looks like lazy writing becomes, under the theory, a grimly accurate portrait of addiction's long toll. This second theory carries a weight the authorial one does not, because it touches something painfully true about real lives. Addiction does change people. It does dull minds that were once quick, dim personalities that were once bright, and turn thoughtful people into shadows of who they were. The theory takes that real and sorrowful pattern and finds it written into a cartoon dog, and the recognition is what gives the idea its sting. A viewer who has watched addiction reshape someone they know may look at Brian's slow decline and feel a flicker of something far heavier than the show ever intended, the sense of watching a familiar tragedy play out in an unlikely place. The honest assessment of both theories is that they are creative interpretations rather than hidden truths. The simpler explanations hold. Brian appears in so many small episodes because he and Stewie make a reliable comedic pair that writers enjoy building stories around. His decline matches the broad flattening that touched every character on the show. No secret authorship and no carefully plotted depiction of brain damage is required to account for either pattern. The theories impose a design where the real cause is the ordinary machinery of television production. What makes them worth telling anyway is what they reveal about the character at their center. Both theories, in their different ways, take Brian seriously, treating him as a figure rich enough to carry hidden meaning. One finds in him a secret genius, the other a slow tragedy, and both reflect how much the audience invested in a character the show often used as little more than a talking prop. Fans do not build elaborate theories around characters they find boring. They build them around characters they cannot stop thinking about, and the fact that Brian inspired both a theory of hidden authorship and a theory of hidden decline shows how deeply he lodged himself in the imagination of the people who watched. For the generation that grew up with the show, these Brian theories often land with a quiet poignancy, because they ask the audience to look again at a character they may have taken for granted. The dog who delivered the smart remarks and nursed the endless drinks turns out, in the hands of the fans, to be the most interpretable figure in the entire show, the one whose every trait can be read as a clue to something deeper. Whether as the secret author shaping the world, or as the addict slowly losing himself within it, Brian becomes, through these theories, the character who carries the most hidden weight, the one the audience could not help but build stories about. These theories so far have stayed within the borders of a single show, finding their meaning inside the world of Quahog. The next set of theories breaks through those borders entirely. They argue that Family Guy is not a self-contained world at all, but one corner of a much larger connected universe, secretly linked to other shows by the same creators, with characters and clues crossing between them in ways that suggest a hidden map far bigger than any one program. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fans turned the family dog into either a secret author or a slow tragedy, proof of how much weight a single character could carry. The next theories tear down the walls of Quahog entirely. They claim the show is one piece of a far larger connected universe, stitched to other programs by hidden clues. Section 9. Everything is connected. There is a particular thrill that comes from discovering that two separate things are secretly one thing. A hidden passage between two houses. A family connection between two strangers. A thread that ties together stories that seem to have nothing to do with each other. Audiences love this feeling, the sudden widening of a world they thought they understood, and fans of Family Guy have chased that feeling further than almost any other part of the show's lore. They became convinced that Quahog is not a closed world at all, but one room in a far larger house, connected by secret doors to other shows, other towns, even other famous cartoons, all of it part of a single vast and hidden map. Some of these connections are not theories at all, but established fact, and they form the foundation on which the wilder ideas were built. The creator behind Family Guy went on to make other animated programs, and those programs have crossed paths in plain sight. One of the Griffin's own neighbors, Cleveland, departed Quahog to anchor a spin-off series of his own, a clear and undeniable link between two shows sharing the same character. Another of the creator's programs has exchanged nods and crossover moments with Family Guy over the years, the kind of winking acknowledgement that confirms the shows know about one another. These real connections gave fans permission to wonder how much deeper the links might run, and once that wondering began, it did not stop. The boldest of the resulting theories concerns a character from one of the creator's other shows, a teenage boy who is one of the main figures in that separate program. A theory that circulated circulated through the fan community, originally posted by an account that has since vanished, proposed that this boy is secretly one of the Griffin family's own children, a long-lost Griffin somehow living a parallel life in another show entirely. The idea sounds absurd on its face, two characters from two different programs revealed as secret siblings, and the theorist embraced that absurdity. Yet the very existence of the theory shows how badly fans wanted the shows to be one continuous world, how eager they were to find blood ties running beneath the surface of programs that were never meant to share a family tree. A subtler and stranger connection theory grew out of the voices behind the characters. Fans noticed that a single distinguished actor lends his voice to two very different small characters across two of the creators' shows, voicing a commanding authority figure on one program and the inner thoughts of a little girl on the other. On its own, this is just a casting coincidence, the same performer hired for two roles. But one of the shows had established that its world contained a device, allowing a person to secretly control an avatar of any shape and size, including, in one episode, a baby. The theory put these pieces together into something eerie, suggesting that the little girl whose inner voice matches the authority figure is in fact that figure in disguise, an adult secretly operating a child avatar across the boundary between shows. A shared voice actor became, in the hands of the fans, evidence of a hidden character secretly crossing from one program into another. Beyond these specific links lies a grander and more philosophical version of the connection theory, one that questions the very reality of the shows themselves. This idea proposes that the programs are not merely connected but nested, that one show is secretly a television program existing inside the world of another. Fans pointed to moments where the shows seemed to acknowledge their own artificiality, scenes where the characters behaved as if they were actors on a set, episodes that pulled back the curtain to reveal a fictional production crew, an installment that offered a behind-the-scenes look at the performers supposedly playing the Griffins. From these moments, the theory built a vision of layered realities, shows within shows, the characters of one program watching another as entertainment, the whole structure folding in on itself like a set of nested boxes. Under this reading, the question of which world is real and which is the show playing inside it becomes genuinely tangled, with different fans arguing for different arrangements of who contains whom. The connection theories did not confine themselves to the creators' own programs either. The most audacious of them reached across to one of the most famous animated families in television history, a show with no connection to Family Guy's creator at all. A theory emerged proposing that a notorious elderly villain from that other long-running cartoon is secretly an aged version of Stewie, the Griffin baby grown old and bitter across the decades. The two characters share certain surface features, a thin frame, a sharp and scheming mind, an air of refined menace, and the theory spun those resemblances into a claim of secret identity, imagining Stewie's entire future laid out in the form of a character from a completely separate show. The leap is enormous, bridging two unrelated programs through nothing more than a resemblance, and it stands as perhaps the clearest example of how far the hunger for hidden connections could carry the fans. Closer to home, other theories tried to redraw the family lines within Quahog and its connected shows, proposing secret parentages and hidden relations among characters the shows treated as unrelated. One such idea suggested that a child from the spin-off series is secretly Peter's biological offspring, weaving a thread of hidden blood between the two programs. Another reached for a character from an entirely different show and proposed that one of the Griffin's neighbors had once been that character in disguise. Each of these theories follows the same basic impulse, the desire to find that the boundaries between characters and between shows are thinner and more porous than they appear, that everyone is secretly linked to everyone else if only the audience looks closely enough. The honest assessment of this whole cluster of theories is that it mixes a small amount of truth with a great deal of imaginative reach. The real crossovers and the genuine spin-off are facts, documented connections that the shows themselves created on purpose. The wilder claims, the secret siblings, the disguised avatars, the aged villain from another franchise, are fan inventions with no support beyond resemblance and coincidence. The shows were made by overlapping creative teams who enjoyed referencing one another, and that overlap naturally produced echoes and similarities that an eager audience could read as hidden design. A shared voice actor, a similar character type, a winking crossover gag, none of these require a secret unified universe to explain. They are the ordinary fingerprints of creators working across multiple projects at once. What the theories reveal, more than any hidden map, is the particular joy of treating fiction as a puzzle to be solved. The fans who built these connections were not really trying to prove a literal truth about how the shows fit together. They were playing, taking pleasure in the act of noticing, in the thrill of spotting a link that others had missed, in the imaginative work of assembling scattered details into a grand secret structure. The connection theories are an expression of love through attention, the kind of close watching that only comes from caring deeply about a show and wanting it to contain more than it appears to. A casual viewer never notices that the same actor voices two small characters. Only someone watching with real devotion catches that, and only someone delighted by the catch turns it into a theory. For the generation that grew up with these shows, the connection theories offer a way of expanding a familiar world without leaving it. A person who watched Family Guy and its sibling programs throughout their life carries all of those worlds in their memory at once, and the theories give those separate memories a way to touch, to become one larger thing rather than several smaller ones. There is a comfort in imagining that the shows you loved across the years were secretly one continuous universe, that the hours spent in Quahog and the hours spent in the other towns were all visits to the same vast place. The theories turn a scattered viewing history into a unified world, and for fans who grew up moving between these shows, that unification has its own quiet appeal. The theories explored so far, whatever their reach, have stayed tethered to something defensible, built on real canon or real connections even when they stretch those things past their limit. The final group of theories lets go of that tether almost entirely. These are the ideas that push into territory so dark and so strange that even devoted fans hesitate over them. Theories that reimagine the show as a prison of the afterlife, that find lifelong tragedy hidden in a single character's voice, and that brush up against a genuine and chilling thread connecting the show's creator to one of the darkest days in living memory. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The hunt for hidden links turned the show into one room of a vast secret house, stitched to other towns and even other cartoons by clues only the devoted ever noted. The final theories abandon almost every limit. They reach toward the afterlife, toward buried lifelong sorrow, and toward a real and unsettling thread tied to the show's own creator. Section 10. The theories that go too far. Some ideas are dark in a way that still feels like play, a pleasant shiver enjoyed from a safe distance. Others cross a line into a darkness that stops being fun, that lingers after the video ends, and changes how a person feels about something they once watched without a second thought. The theories that close out this story belong to that second kind. They are the ones that reach past clever reinterpretation into genuinely unsettling territory. The readings that even devoted fans approach carefully, because once absorbed they are difficult to set back down. The first of them takes the show's gentlest quality, its timelessness, and turns it into something quietly sinister. Like most long-running cartoons, Family Guy exists in a kind of frozen present, where the characters never truly age, where the baby stays a baby, and the children stay children no matter how many years pass in the real world. Audiences accept this without thinking, treating it as a simple convention of the form. One theory refuses to accept it, and instead asks why the family never grows older, then supplies a chilling answer. The reason no one ages, this theory proposes, is that Stewie is deliberately keeping them all frozen. Using the same advanced technology that powers his time machine and his other inventions, the baby genius holds the entire family in a state of suspended youth, refusing to let time move forward, all so that he can continue his adventures with Brian without ever losing his closest companion to age or to change. A harmless cartoon convention becomes, under this reading, the act of a character imprisoning his own family in time out of a desperate refusal to let things end. There is a strange sadness folded into this idea, beneath its unsettling surface. The theory casts Stewie not as a villain in the ordinary sense, but as a child so terrified of loss that he stops time itself to prevent it, freezing the people around him rather than face a future in which they grow apart or disappear. The bond between Stewie and Brian, the warmest relationship the show ever built, becomes the motive for a quiet horror, a love so possessive that it traps everyone in an endless present. The theory takes the sweetness at the heart of the show and reveals a darkness inside it, the way an embrace held too tightly becomes a cage. The second theory reaches even further, past time and into the question of death itself, by proposing that the Griffins are not living at all. This reading holds that the family exists in a kind of purgatory, a waiting place between life and whatever comes after, which would explain the strange invulnerability that has always defined the show. The characters survive impossible disasters, walk away from catastrophes that would kill anyone, and reset to normal no matter what befalls them, and the purgatory theory offers a grim reason. They cannot truly die because they are, in some sense, already dead, suspended in an afterlife where harm has no permanence and nothing ever really ends. The endless cycle of the show, the way each episode returns everything to where it began, becomes the eternal loop of souls caught somewhere they cannot leave. Like the grief theory examined earlier, this one finds dark meaning in the show's casual relationship with death, reading the character's immortality as a sign of something terrible rather than as a simple cartoon convenience. It is, again, entirely a fan creation, contradicted by the show's actual canon of time travel and parallel worlds, which offer their own internal explanations for the same survival. But the purgatory reading persists because it answers a question the show never bothered to address, transforming an ordinary feature of animation into evidence of a haunting hidden state. The third dark reading is different from the others, because it grows out of something the show genuinely did rather than something the fans invented from nothing. In one of its later episodes, the show pulled back the curtain on Stewie himself in a way that startled longtime viewers. Through a session with a therapist, the program revealed that Stewie's famous upper-class accent, the defining feature of his entire character, was never real at all. It was an affectation, a deliberate performance, a kind of armor the child had constructed to get himself through the day, and beneath it, his true voice was that of an ordinary small boy. The same episode brushed against his long running and never settled questions about his own identity, treating his sense of being different as a source of deep and genuine isolation rather than as a mere joke. The darker reading that fans and critics drew from this reveal takes the show's reluctant honesty and follows it to a sadder conclusion than the program itself fully committed to. Under this interpretation, the entire persona of Stewie, the grand accent, the air of superiority, even the cartoonish villainy, is the elaborate disguise of a frightened and lonely child hiding who he really is. The brilliance and the menace that the show played for laughs become a mask over a small person terrified of being known, performing a heightened version of himself because he believes the real version would never be accepted. The comedy of the character curdles, in this reading, into a quiet tragedy of repression, a portrait of someone so afraid of his own truth that he builds an entire false self to live behind. What the show offered as a clever twist, the fans received as something genuinely mournful, the loneliest reading of the show's most beloved character. The final dark thread is the heaviest of all, because it leaves the world of the show entirely and touches a real tragedy in the real world. It concerns the show's creator and one of the darkest days in living memory. On the morning of the terrorist attacks of September 2001, the creator was booked to fly on one of the very planes that would be hijacked and flown into the towers in New York. By a thin margin of chance, a mistaken travel time, and a difficult morning, he did not make the flight. He survived the day that so many others did not, spared by the smallest of accidents from being aboard a plane that became an instrument of mass death. A theory grew around this terrible fact, connecting it to a feature-length film the show produced built around the character of Stewie. Fans proposed that the film, with its themes of a character confronting his own future and his own mortality, was secretly the creator's way of processing the survival he had stumbled into. An artist working through the impossible weight of having narrowly missed his own death while strangers perished in his place. Whether the film truly carried that hidden meaning is something no theory can prove, and it belongs to the realm of speculation rather than fact. The underlying event, though, is real and documented, and it casts a genuinely sobering shadow over the whole enterprise. The man who built a comedy famous for laughing at death had come within a hair's breadth of dying in one of the most public horrors of the age, and that knowledge gives the show's relationship with mortality a weight that no fan theory needed to invent. Taken together, these final theories mark the outer edge of how far the audience was willing to follow the show into the dark. They reach into frozen time and the afterlife, into lifelong repression and real-world catastrophe, and they show an audience determined to find profound and often painful meaning in a program the world often dismissed as crude. None of the invented ones are true in any official sense. The show never confirmed a single one of them, and its actual canon contradicts most. Yet they endure, because they answer a hunger that the literal show could not satisfy. The desire to believe that something silly contains something deep, that the laughter sits on top of something that matters. Looking back across this entire journey, a strange symmetry comes into view between the two halves of the story. The lore, the documented history of the show, turned out to be genuinely stranger than fiction. A tale of a college film that conquered television, of a show killed and resurrected by its own fans, of a beloved character murdered and brought back by a baby with a time machine, of infinite universes, and a vault of forbidden episodes. The theories, built by the audience on top of that history, reached for something the lore alone could not provide, weaving grief and tragedy and hidden design into a comedy that never asked for any of it. The real history gave the fans a world unstable enough to support any idea, and the fans filled that instability with meaning the show had never intended. For the generation that grew up with this show, holding both halves at once produces a quiet and lasting feeling. The program that filled so many ordinary evenings, that seemed at the time like nothing more than a string of crude jokes, turns out to carry beneath it both a remarkable true history and a vast hidden architecture of meaning that its own audience constructed out of love and attention. To learn the lore is to see how improbable the show's existence really was. To know the theories is to see how much the people who watched it cared, how much depth they were willing to imagine into a cartoon, how badly they wanted it to be more than it appeared. The show that laughed at everything became, in the hands of its fans, a thing capable of holding real sorrow, real wonder, and real mystery, and that transformation may be the most surprising piece of lore of all. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.